All right, I'm in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I'm going to spend some time in verses 20 and 21 in this message. Beginning in verse 20, he says, "Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe." All right, now I'm going to start, I think, at the end of verse 21 and then kind of work my way backwards. But before I do this, let's review the three different types of people, because the three different types of people or groups of people are described here. You have the Gentiles, which can also be described as the Greeks, just as a general term. You have the Jews, and then you have the Christians, or the new believers, those who have entered into the new covenant that God has established. Those are the three different groups of people. If you have a peek at verse 20, he says, "Where is the wise? Where is the scribe?" Okay, to say where is the wise, that kind of implies that he's talking about the Greeks or the Greek philosophers, the Gentiles. And then where is the scribe? The scribe is generally referring to one of the Jews. Okay, somebody who is transcribing the scriptures, who's making copies of the scriptures. And there would be an expectation that they would be quite familiar with the scriptures that they make copies of. All right, and then he refers to himself and them. So you got these three different groups of people, and they all have their own perspective of what it means to know God, or who God is, or what it would mean to have a relationship with Him. But at the end of verse 21, the end of verse 21, he says that there is a message that is preached that is foolishness, okay, to those of the world, which means those who are both Gentiles and Jews. Now, if one of us were making this up, all right, if one of us were coming up with the standards by which people may know the Lord, then we probably would not present a message that would be unacceptable to the overwhelming majority of people. If you say something, if you present something to people and you want them to believe it, to present something that is going to be quite unbelievable, all right, not because it's fantastic, but just because it's just going to be foolishness to other people, is not going to appeal to many people, all right? And so what God does is He presents something to everyone in the world that the world is going to perceive as foolish or as foolishness. Okay? Now, the message that is presented is the truth of who God is and what it is that He wants and what it is that He is doing. It's the truth of that. But this is incompatible. It's incompatible with what people generally believe on their own, either the Greek or the Jew. They have their own beliefs that they have established, and when God presents something to them that is contrary to what they believe, this is going to be difficult. Not very many people are going to be willing to say that they are wrong, okay, or that they don't know something, or they don't know someone. That is a real struggle for people. The only people who can make it past that are people who really do want to know their God as a person. Those are the only people who are going to make it through that, and there are very few of those. But it's better for God to reach out to the entire world and get these very few, get some, than to get nobody. All right? So that's the general situation. Now let's consider the perspective of the Greek or the Gentile, and then the perspective of the Jew and what they think about their gods, okay, or their perception of God and what it means to have a relationship with God from their point of view. It's important to understand what other people believe and why, not so you can, give them, personally attack them and ridicule them, but just because there has to be some degree of understanding between people. Doesn't mean they have to agree, but understanding is very valuable. In general, the Greeks or the Gentiles were people who believed mainly in destiny, or what is known in the Christian world as providence in general. And this belief about God means a number of things. For example, this is a God who does not change. Okay, he does not change. He knows everything. He's in control of everything. All right. By the time they get done with defining their God, they get a God who is not relational. All right. You cannot have a relationship with somebody who doesn't have some degree of change within them. Okay. I'll give you an example of how God changes. He changes the way that he relates to people. For those who have rejected the new covenant that he has provided, he relates to them in one way. And for those who have accepted the covenant that he has provided, he relates to them in a different way. That's a change. Okay? And you will realize this change when you go from being an unbeliever to a believer. Well, then there's a change in terms of the relationship between you and God. That's a simple way to understand that. He is responsive, okay? Being relational and being a participant in the lives of people means that he is also responsive. If you go through the scriptures, you'll see on many occasions God declares things like, if you do this, then I will do this. Okay, that's being responsive to say that he's going to change the way that he relates to people, the way that he participates in people's lives. That's what I mean. And this is generally unacceptable to the philosophy of the Greeks. All right? So when this is presented to them, okay, that this is a God who is relational, then they would perceive that to be foolish because it does not conform to what they already think is true. Okay, and to challenge what they already think is true can be difficult, especially if they really don't care too much about the truth, but they care more about the consequences related to changing their point of view. Such as, what are their friends and family going to think about them? Okay, that usually has a lot more weight in a person's life than what is true and what is not true. So this is an issue. This is a confrontation that takes place as God goes into the world and he is exposed. Okay, when he is presented, then there is the opportunity for this kind of confrontation. Okay, now what is the relationship of the Jews? What's the Jews? What is the Jews' relationship with God? What does that really look like? That was defined by the law, and that is a responsive kind of relationship. If the Jews will obey the law, then God will respond and he will bless them. And if they do not, then he will curse them. Okay, so what's it going to be? Is it going to be blessings or curses? That describes change. Okay, or at least that's the kind of change that I'm referring to in terms of how God will relate to people. Okay, now when the new covenant is presented to the religious Jew, all right, the religious Jew already has their idea of what this relationship is supposed to be. The idea is what God presented. To establish the nation of Israel, he gave them the law, And in the law, he said, if you will obey, then you will be blessed. And if you don't, then you will be cursed. And so from the Jewish point of view, that defines the relationship. When the new covenant went into effect, God defined a new kind of relationship. All right? And this is presented through forgiveness. What forgiveness does is it fulfills the demands of the law. All right? The demands of the law are obey or die. Okay, as a general summary. And of course, nobody is going to obey to God's satisfaction of perfection that is required, because that's what he says. He says you have to do all of the commandments. Okay? And so if a person is not going to comply with all of them, well, then there needs to be some reconciliation for that. And of course, there are ways according to the law to deal with sin. But this is a new way of addressing the issue. And that's by God declaring, you know what? I'm just going to forgive all of it. So even though the law demands obedience or death, God died on our behalf. That's the representation of what he accomplished. So that from his point of view, he has died on our behalf. It's not like our lives were worth giving anyway. They definitely were not. And somebody giving their life for their own sins is not going to resolve the sin issue anyway. So he decided to resolve this issue. Okay, now what will the Jew really lose if they embrace the new covenant? Okay, what are they really going to lose? Okay, well, there is a belief that they are going to lose the opportunity to be blessed by God through their repentance and obedience. They're afraid they're going to lose that. Okay, but I'll tell you, they're not going to get it anyway. So from that point of view, they're not going to lose anything. But people just really want to believe that they're going to be able to get blessed by God because of what they do. When the new covenant is presented to say, well, you are to receive the blessings that God has given because of what he has done, all right, then that's a completely different message. And it is. It's a different covenant entirely. Not because there was something wrong with the old one, but because there was something wrong with the people. Which, of course, people don't want to accept that there's something wrong with them. In general, it requires a person to acknowledge, you know what, there really is something wrong with me in order to go in this direction. All right, but this is how the Jews would perceive the message of the new covenant. They would perceive it as foolishness because they are afraid that it's going to take away their opportunity to have a relationship with God that they never will be able to have anyway. All right, for the Greek, for the Gentile, they are afraid that they will have a God in their life that is not like the one that they thought they had, or the one that they would prefer to have. So these are the obstacles that people have to deal with. Now, it's easy to deal with these obstacles if you just simply ignore the reality of God, who he really is. You just simply ignore the evidence. Ignore what God has presented in the world that he created that would allow a person to see who he is, enough that they would recognize that there's something wrong with them, that they need forgiveness, things like that. There's enough there. But through his believers, he exposes himself even more. All right? Through those of us who believe in him according to the new covenant, he exposes himself within and through us so that he is presented to the people of the world, whether they are of the Greek philosophy or the Jewish philosophy, which is a way of summarizing everybody. Either the non-Jew or the Jew. That's everybody. He uses his people to reveal himself. And this is going to happen whether you like it or not. He's going to manifest himself within you if you are close to him. If you know who he is, he is going to be exposed from within and through you. This is just the way it's going to be. I remember early on in my faith when I would go and visit a congregation of people, and it was noticeable that I knew the Lord. That was pretty obvious. And for a lot of people, not because of what I said, I didn't go in there and create conflict or try to engage in deep discussions or debate with people, or try to impose my beliefs on anybody. In general, I didn't have to say anything, or very little. They could just tell, that I knew somebody, and I did. I knew somebody. I knew my God. I knew who he was. And these, in general, were people who did not know who he is. Okay? And that was a confrontation. There was an exposure of who he really is. And I was very kind and very polite and very respectful with people. Sometimes people would have a curiosity to the extent that they would want to engage in a conversation with me, and then they would discover some of these things. Other people, they just didn't want to know. Fine. Let's talk about other things. There's no reason to argue about anything. All right? And so I will say that just because of our existence, okay, as people who know the Lord, there is going to be an exposure of who he is, and people are going to be confronted with this. And the confrontation is, are you willing to let go of what you believe to believe this or not? And that should be done on the basis of what is true. And there's a lot to consider when making decisions like that. So, of course, they shouldn't be made quickly and lightly, and they should be, these things should definitely be taken into consideration. All right, now where does this really come from? It comes from the design of God, when he designed humanity to begin with. When Adam and Eve were created, he declared that he created them to be in his image. Okay? Now that word has a specific meaning in Hebrew. It means to be a reflection of God. Okay, similar to what you would see if you were to go and look in a mirror. Okay, if you look in a mirror, then you would see a reflection of who you are. All right? The mirror is not you. It's just simply presenting a reflection of you. So also, we are not God. We are going to be just a reflection of who he is. And so that those in the world, if they were to look at a person who is in the image of God, then they would see a reflection of God. It obviously is not going to be a perfect reflection. It's just a general way of understanding what God intended when he created humanity to begin with. And that's what that word means. It means a reflection that you would see off of a mirror, or it's usually used to describe the reflection off of a body of water. All right, and so mankind, Adam and Eve, were designed to be a reflection of him, but they have to receive something to reflect. They have to receive him. There has to be some relationship that's going on that allows them to be the recipients of who he is, to reflect him onto others, so that others would see the invisible God through a visible person. All right? Now, when they fell in the Garden of Eden, when they ate from the wrong tree, which was a violation of the law that God established, he withdrew his Holy Spirit from within them. And when he did that, then he was no longer there to relate to them so that they could be a reflection of who he is. All right, so there was a change that took place. God related to people in a different way now. All right? Instead of being a reflection of what it's like to have God in your life as a person. All right? Instead of being a reflection of the relationship you personally have with God through his indwelling presence within you, now they are a reflection of what it's like not to have God. So that was a significant change. Adam and Eve were in the image of God, and then they were no longer in the image of God. All right, with this kind of definition. Now, I'm not saying that we can't say from a general perspective we are in the image of God. You know, I understand what that means, or at least I have a perception of that. That what that means is that this was his original intent, that there is certainly the opportunity for that, the capacity for that. When the Holy Spirit dwells within a new believer, there is a kind of reflection that takes place such that people are now once again in the image of God, but this is in a different way than it was during the original creation. The way things were in the original creation will never be again. All right, it's never going to be like that again. It's always going to be different, and it's different now. So from a general perspective, to say that we were created in the image of God, sure, we were, but then, well, you know, things changed. Okay, that's one way to look at it. Or to say that we were created in the image of God, that was the intent of God, but there's some difficulties, related to that, namely that we're not reflecting him. Okay, so there are some general issues that can allow for us to still say that we're in the image of God. I wouldn't argue these words and try to drill down on specifics because it just is not important. What is important is, are we in a relationship with God personally, or are we not? If we are, then he will reflect himself within and through us anyway. And so what's the point of having a conversation of if before or if after, or what it was in between? All of that becomes irrelevant. Okay? When you become a new creation in Christ Jesus, your God is going to reflect himself within and through you. And how that happens or how that didn't happen isn't going to matter anymore. What matters is that we are to receive what he has for us. When we receive what he has for us, then he will be manifested to the world within and through us, where he will use our eyes to see with, our ears to hear with, our mouths to speak with, and our hands to touch with. The invisible God will become visible to a limited extent, just enough so that people are confronted with the reality that he is, and that he is different from who they would like him to be, or from who they think he is. And that is what he is doing, to invite people to come to him for who he really is. You know, to the Gentile, to the Greek, they got their idea about who they want God to be, and that just isn't who he is. To the Jew, they got their idea of what they want God to be, who they want him to be. And he's just not going to be that person. All right, again, because they're not going to obey the law to the standard that is required. So he fulfilled it through forgiveness by saying, okay, well, he forgives, so that the law demands obedience or death. He died on our behalf. Now it's, okay, the demands have been fulfilled. So there's no longer any law that has any place in the relationship. Instead, there is now a new relationship according to the new covenant, which is something completely different. All right, let me take a peek at my notes here. So the Jews are afraid to lose their blessings. One thing that both the Jew and the Gentile, that those who don't know the Lord, one thing that they will not be able to get in touch with is the idea of a changed heart or knowing God as a person. They don't have that as part of their theological beliefs per se. And so that's a completely different thing. That's a new thing. Let me go ahead and go to verse 21. For since and talk about the wisdom of God concerning this, because all of this is wise. God was wise in presenting himself in this way that would be perceived as foolish, because he's after a very small, select kind of people. All right, just a certain kind of person. Who is this person? This is a person who really wants to know who he is, for who he really is. In verse 21, for since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God. All right? That's extraordinary, right? Through the wisdom, through the effort, through the debate, through the discussions. Okay, the Greeks who were pursuing the knowledge of God, they never got to the point of actually knowing who he is. For the Jew, that wasn't part of the old covenant. Knowing who God is irrelevant. All right, are we going to get blessed by him? That's what's relevant. Okay, knowing him as a person just has no relevance. Through the wisdom, for since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God. They completely failed. It pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. And that's what I was talking about with regards to the message that is presented is going to be foolishness to these people, only to a very select group, a select few. And they have to acknowledge their condition, embrace his provision. You know, there's a lot to capture when it comes to that. Otherwise, they're just simply not going to be saved. And what's really, and also what I want to mention again what I said earlier, that this is intentionally pursuing few people. It's a message that is going to be rejected by the majority of people. Whereas if it was something that we were coming up with, some kind of theologian was coming up with to try to define God and define a new relationship, they would probably be after the majority, not some small, extremely small, micro small minority. Let me go back up to verse 20. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? All right, well, has he? Has he made the wisdom of this world foolish? Again, the way that I describe this is to say that he makes it foolish because there is no changed heart and they do not know the Lord. All right, they do not know their God. That's how he made it. That's how he effectively established it as foolishness. Okay, he made foolish the wisdom of this world because they were a failure in knowing him. All right, that's what he says, that they did not, in verse 21, did not know God. So he made their wisdom foolish because they did not know God. When God was presented to them, they rejected what was presented because they don't know who he is. Okay, so this is considered to be success from God's perspective, and it's necessary because you just can't have, you can't have all these beliefs. God does not, doesn't have multiple opinions about these things. He has one opinion about these things. He's not a certain kind of person for the Gentiles and a certain kind of person for the Jews. He is the one person, and they both have to convert to the new covenant and be born again as a child of God. All right, now when we know him, right, according to verse 21, when we do know him, okay, then we can have the personal conviction to stand up for who he is. All right? That doesn't mean that we have to be rude and belligerent and stuff like that. Doesn't mean we ever even have to say anything. But we, by default, are going to stand up for who he is. through our conviction of what we know is true because of our changed heart and because of the relationship that we have with him as an active participant in his life, and he is an active participant in our lives. And as that grows and develops, we have an increase in confidence that this is true and this is real. What Paul effectively says by asking these questions, well, where are they? Where is this person? Where is that person? Hey, bring them on. That's a reasonable summary for verse 20. Bring it on. Bring it on. What do you people know of God? Really, that's true. What do you really know? Bring it on. And if you have an argumentative person, you don't have to engage in an argument to convince them of what you believe. You can just respond by trying to get them to convince you of what they believe. I've seen that. When I can tell that a person is not going to be receptive to what it is that I have to share with them, I don't even bother. Okay, it's just gonna agitate them. And what's the point of that? Is it because I got some personal issues that I need to feel important or something, or to feel like I'm powerful or have some kind of value because I make somebody upset? Okay, because I violate them? Am I going to be impressive to God? Is God going to say, oh yeah, that's really impressive that you stood up for me like that, and those people, they didn't believe, it didn't change anything. All they do is feel a little bit more antagonistic. Get them to convince you, where I have done that. I've said, listen, if this is what you think is true, I will try to understand that. Okay? But you're saying some things that are inconsistent with things that we can see, that we can know, that have been clearly revealed. And so I will say that I'm going to have some trouble with that. I'm going to have to think about that. And I'm going to have to try to reconcile that with these other things. And if I can't, there's nothing I can do with that. That's different from the other point of view of being antagonistic, which is what some people will do as they try to relate to other people. Okay, so where is the wise? Where is the scribe? All right. Where is the Greek? Where's the person of Greek philosophy? Where is the person of Jewish philosophy? Bring them on. All right, don't be afraid of them. Bring them on. Where is the disputer? Bring them on. Not so that we can dispute with them, but instead let them convince you. Bring it on. Let's see what you got. Okay? And the more that you know your God as a person, the more that you'll be able to respond well to what is presented to you by the Greek theologian, by the religious Jew, by someone who wants to dispute or argue. The better you'll be able to respond to those kinds of things. And Paul is establishing that is from his perspective, talking with the Corinthians. He's talking with the Corinthians and he's saying from his perspective, these people do not intimidate him at all. They just don't. Bring them on. Why? Because he knows his God. And through saying that, he is encouraging them to know their God. If they will just know their God more and more, then they will see this. They will see what he's expressing to them, and it will make a big difference. All right, I'm going to pause there. For those of you who are using this for small groups, I got a question that I thought of. Have you been like a Greek philosopher, or have you been like a Gentile, or have you been kind of like a Jew in the way that you have thought of God? Just from the general descriptions that I've given, you've thought of God in the past, hopefully different than how you think of him now. But how you thought of him before, would you say that those beliefs were a little bit more compatible with the Greek philosophical way of thinking, Or would you say that those beliefs were more of a Judaic way of thinking? Okay, both of which are foolishness to God, but still, to try to think about it from that perspective in order to have a sense for how far you've come, because you need to get away from both of those. And there probably is a combination of the two. All right, and I'll continue in the next message. Thanks.